In my two previous videos in this series on Pyrrhonism and Perspectivism, we covered the limits of certainty, the seeming impossibility to establish absolute and complete knowledge, free from arbitrariness and bias. In this video, we will be exploring the following question: is finding meaning in spite of uncertainty even possible? To do so, I will present the existentialist school of thought and the main concepts associated with it. For once, the answer should be more hopeful, as according to existentialism, the answer to this question is yes. But before tackling the reasoning behind that answer, we first need to understand what stands in the way of meaning and why we would ask this question in the first place. In order to do so, let's cover the main existential stakes of human existence. The first stake is death, or more generally, the limit of time. Our existence, as we currently understand it, will end. All of our accomplishments are ephemeral. Eventually, who we are, what we did, and all of our deeds will be forgotten. On top of the anxiety of death, this brings into question why we should bother doing anything, seeing as everything we might build and acquire will be lost and destroyed eventually. The second stake is fundamental isolation. It refers to the fact that it's impossible to fully share our inner experiences, be it perceptions, thoughts, or feelings, with others. We may be able to convey some of it through communication and empathy, but we can never know whether this generates the same subjective experience for our interlocutor. It's impossible to describe a color to someone who's never seen it before, or a taste to someone who's never eaten a specific food. This is a limit on our ability to connect and commune with others. We are confined to a certain baseline level of existential loneliness. This can lead some to question whether it's even worth trying. The third stake is freedom. At any time, there is usually a vast amount of options we can choose from. With a substantial level of freedom comes a proportional level of responsibility. This ties back to the fundamental uncertainty we covered in the two previous videos, namely, how can we know whether we're making the right choices? There is a significant risk we'll make the wrong decision, and we'll have to live with the consequences, tormented with regret. The seeming unlimited amount of choice within the scope of a limited life, devoid of definite guidance, can create a sense of confusion, overwhelm, and vertigo. It can leave us paralyzed in a state of existential anxiety and dread. The last stake is meaning. Meaning is a crucial human need. When we don't feel like what we're doing is serving a greater purpose, we can lose all motivation. Without a good reason to do anything, we're left dejected and despondent. Unfortunately, based on the combination of all the previous stakes we mentioned, considering the limits of time, and with it the seeming futility of any achievement, the limits of connection and knowledge, combined with all the possible choices we could make, how can we know what we should do? How can we find meaning and purpose? How can we escape arbitrariness? And if we can't, how do we avoid succumbing to despair and apathy? These questions lead us to absurdism. Absurdism is a philosophical theory that the universe is fundamentally meaningless. Albert Camus famously symbolized it with the myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus was a vicious king in Greek mythology who violated the rules of hospitality by killing guests in his palace and cheated death twice by tricking the gods. So when he was finally caught, he was condemned by Hades to push a boulder up a hill. Every time he finally reaches the peak, the boulder falls back down to the very bottom and he must start again and again. He's cursed to repeat this futile task infinitely. This serves as a metaphor for the human condition. The conflict between our desire for meaning and the meaningless world we seem to inhabit binds us to an endless, futile, and absurd struggle of pursuing meaning. This is Absurdism's thesis. The question now becomes, how can we cope with this dreadful fate? I say we can summarize the options into three main stances. It's possible to mix and match between them to an extent, and there might be a few variants, but these are the three main strategies: nihilism, dogmatism, and existentialism. The first one is nihilism. Its stance is to surrender to the fact that there is no intrinsic meaning in anything. However, it's more of a psychological condition than a strict philosophical doctrine. In practice, it tends to lead to a pessimistic and cynical outlook that falls back onto hedonism, namely the disappointed short-term pursuit of whatever brings pleasure and avoiding pain. It's plagued by a general sense of dread and pointlessness. It makes more sense to think of nihilism as a psychological condition than a consistent philosophical framework. Because if you think about it, if nothing makes more sense than anything else, then there is no more reason to pursue pleasure over any other action. There's technically no action that you can take that is consistent with nihilism. It's not a constructive foundation, it's a black hole. The reason nihilists tend to gravitate towards pleasure-seeking is because pure nihilism is incompatible with life. As I said in my video on absolute relativism, life is predicated on preferences and striving towards specific goals, such as survival and reproduction. Living without drive is self-defeating. It leads to despair, gradual depression, and apathy, and ultimately giving up on life itself. This makes it both an unpleasant and unsustainable option. Nihilism is more of a constant underlying risk and emotional reaction to the inability to secure meaning than an intentional decision. So let's explore the other options in hopes of finding something better. The second option, dogmatism, opts for another stance. Rather than submit, it denies absurdism by positing one dogma as the absolute truth. In practice, it tends to lead to fanaticism, seeing as its followers put all their eggs in one basket. They need to cling to this set of beliefs as absolute to keep nihilism at bay. This usually means they will try to push their views on everyone else so they will represent less of a threat, and that usually engenders harm and coercion. It also tends to lead to self-denial to varying degrees. When you subscribe to dogmatism, you must choose one pre-existing dogma. It could be a religion or a political ideology, but it was formulated by an external source. Although you probably relate to it to an extent, it wasn't crafted for you, which means you'll have to contort yourself to fit within it, not out of a genuine wish to improve yourself, but as a prerequisite. This option comes with its set of issues. It's somewhat dishonest and diluted, since as we covered in the previous videos, as humans, and with our logic as we understand it, it's impossible to absolutely prove any claim, whether or not absolute truth does exist. It's also a somewhat incongruent form of living that often leads to harm. Sometimes it's possible to combine a weaker form of both nihilism and dogmatism. You somewhat accept a set of cultural and social beliefs without a strong personal faith in them, which serves to cushion nihilism a bit without too much fanaticism. It allows you to mostly function within society, but it makes for a pretty bleak and bland subjective experience, where you just go through the motions and experience low-tier depression. Once again, neither of those options sound all that great. Our last option is existentialism, which acknowledges rather than denies absurdism, but opts to rebel against it. It decides to embrace agency and authenticity as means to generate one's own sense of meaning. In practice, this is a challenging and long process. It's not a miracle solution. It's a arduous task to craft your best personal understanding and source of meaning. All the while, you must face existential crisis, dread, anxiety, and absurdity through self-determination, authenticity, and bravery. It takes efforts, includes ups and downs, and technically never ends as you need to keep refueling your own sense of purpose. However, it also has some real benefits to it. It's honest in that it acknowledges uncertainty and the weight of the major existential stakes of life. Another perk it has is that it enables living a congruent life. If you do manage to create your own framework to make sense of the world and find meaning within it, the result will be perfectly tailored for you. Lastly, and most importantly, it's the most sustainable and fulfilling option, and therefore the most worthwhile. Now you might be wondering where the name existentialism comes from. It stems from the following claim by Jean-Paul Sartre: for humans, existence precedes essence. This is in opposition to essentialism, according to which your essence, which you could also call your nature or potential, defines your existence. Your nature determines who you become. But Sartre makes the opposite statement. It's your existence, as in your choices, that defines your nature. You are what you do. This is an emphasis on the importance of choice and self-determination in creating one's own purpose and legacy. Technically, existentialism is a broad philosophical current that regroups a lot of different views. Sartre was not its first philosopher. For instance, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche had introduced similar ideas before him. It's more of a stance than a specific set of philosophical tenets, which allows for much diversity. It's a general form of inquiry about the subjective experience of searching for meaning in a meaningless universe, usually by relying on agency, authenticity, and courage. I think the last stanza of William Ernest Henley's poem, Invictus, is a good exemplification of the existentialist mindset and a good place to wrap things up. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishment the scroll, I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul. This video concludes my 3-part series. There are additional ideas I still want to touch on, but my goal with these videos was to convey the most fundamental concepts associated with each of the main school of thoughts that underlie my general philosophy. This allows me to establish a baseline of shared understanding for future videos. Of course, I had to summarize things quite a bit to keep the videos relatively short. In the future, I'll keep covering some of the key concepts of my philosophical viewpoint, but their scope should be a bit reduced and these videos should be more focused on my own thoughts. I hope you found this video interesting. If you didn't watch them yet, you might want to check out the 2 previous ones on Pyrrhonism and Perspectivism. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.